Eu só posso dizer para vocês que esse tipo de experiência que faz o canal crescer é para vocês. E não deixe de se inscrever, não deixe de compartilhar com seus amigos e fazer esse vídeo rodar o mundo. Some people nowadays just arguing that it's bad to work in under pressure and with low gaps of time, a lack of creative range, and the difficult to manage people, manage team. How was it before at the 90s on Gremlin?
It was chaos. Barely managed chaos. I mean, Barry's just alluded to the fact that he was also at a Magitech, and I know some of the chaos that was going on there as well. It was, everything was very primitive and not very professional because it wasn't an industry that had existed. It was just people who had managed to get some money out of making games before, setting up companies and getting in, often young, naive people who were willing to work for very little because they wanted to make games. And yeah, we worked ridiculous hours for ridiculously little money. We were basically, that was our big advantage. We were cheap and we'd been self-funding our learning on how to do things. And we were pretty passionate about it.
And very vocal.
Yeah, we were vocal. We were not particularly organized. There was a lot of egos, a lot of overconfidence, and that overconfidence got us through a lot of things that you would just have given up if you weren't super confident, even if you were completely wrong about how things were going to go. But it was properly Wild West. I mean, I was a bedroom coder. I learned to code in my bedroom while I was a school kid. I spent days and nights locked up with a computer programming, and that's all I wanted to do. So when I got to Gremlin, which was actually the third company I'd worked for, at least the third.
You're a veteran by that point.
I mean, I'd been in the industry for 3 years. So senior programmer by that time, yeah. And it was quite exciting to be fronting basically Top Gear, to have been on it right from the moment we got hold of any kind of dev kit. I was the person who was trying to work out how the dev kit worked, get the basics set up and working, get the framework up and running before anybody else could manage to do anything with it. So I know that the code that I produced to get it up and running on the Super Nintendo, they continued using it for several years after I'd actually left Gremlin.
How is to work nowadays companies with more nice environment for working, okay?
But between now and then is just a huge difference. There's a huge difference in the kind of hardware that we use, the kind of software we've got available, the communications. We've got the access to the internet, the access to knowledge that just didn't exist back then. Without any internet, it was work it out yourself or try and find books in libraries, see if anybody could give you any documentation in any language at all you could try and reverse engineer and make sense of. So it's very restrictive.
I still have the source code for the music.
Do you?
And the file is dated like 1991.
I have an entire box of floppy disks somewhere, well, up in the loft. I don't know if any of them still work, but I think I've still got them all. And I've still got the special SFX chip from in upstairs in a Nintendo Conference 1991 folder. So yeah, still have the odd bits and pieces.
You told me yesterday you still have a treasure, a sealed treasure, right?
I do have sealed, still in the cling film, all of the games that I worked on at Gremlin for the Super Nintendo. up
I
and
believe,
going.
I believe if you and this guy make some signature, it will bring a lot of money in the future if you need it.
Well, they're keepsakes more than anything else. I might sign them before I die, and my daughter can maybe sell them.
Wow.
Oh, very nice.
No way. Mine is a little weird because I really enjoy playing this.
I got my Top Gear. I've actually got the Japanese versions as well, Top Racer.
Nice.
I think I do, yeah.
I had to buy it on eBay. It was like $60. Like, God damn it, that's expensive.
I will ask you both different questions. What's your preferred game that you worked, Ritchie? And Barry, what's your preferred soundtrack you've made for games in your entire career?
So, I mean, if you ask me what my favorite game to work on was ever, it actually was Top Gear. That was my favorite game. Well, Top Gear because it was the first one that had some success. It was the first one where I'd had a lot of control over what the game was going to be and how it was going to be like. Then the rest of the Super Nintendo games that I did after that were also fun, but not quite as good. And then after that time, the whole industry changed very drastically. The way we worked changed very drastically, and you get less and less input into the game. So you may be a key part of a team, but you're not necessarily having a huge amount of creative input. So for me, yeah, Top Gear was oddly, I peaked early, and that was it. So I've worked on a lot of famous games or bits on famous games, but when I point to the bits that I did, most people would not really understand what was involved in that, or whether that was important or not, or whether it was difficult or not. Whereas Top Gear, I can say I did bits of everything.
It's your other side, right?
Yeah.
And
so
there's a lot to that. I think there's a lot to letting your creative people just create and do what they want to do. When I did Horizon Chase, they just let me write whatever I wanted to write, and I think the soundtrack is. I mean, I'm much more happy with the Horizon Chase soundtrack than I am with Top Gear. Top Gear was just such a flash in the pan thing. It was just get some music in, boom, done, next. But
Just
Top Gear, I really wanted
if you guys who are watching this video can hear or haven't heard Horizon Chase soundtrack, I will put the link beside here, so you can hear it. It's amazing.
Thanks. And there's Horizon Chase 2 now as well, a whole nother soundtrack.
Okay, can you show us the new CD?
Well, see, that this would be interesting. Have them listen to the Horizon Chase 1 and then Horizon Chase 2 and see which one they like better. Because Horizon Chase 2, it wasn't just me writing the music. I had to, the art director had the final say on the music. So there was a lot more influence from other people rather than me. It was the approval committee.
Okay, you are not the big star like you are in the first one, right?
Right, exactly.
the first
it's very difficult.
Very Leitch, so I can hear the difference between two.
Interesting. Between the working for game companies.
What's the difference between working for nowadays companies than the old times companies?
Well, I mean, now it ties into that, letting your creative people be creative when it's a small business and there's not much of an investment. It's like, sure, let's see what they come up with. But when you're talking about millions and tens of millions of dollars being invested in games these days, they want to make sure that they're going to get a damn good product out of it. They don't want to can't just let Barry write anything he wants. Fuck, it could be terrible. Let's make sure he writes something that we all really like, and you got to safeguard your investment that way. And that was
another question. When you are composing for nowadays companies, do you put the tunes on the community to ask them if they like it, or you judge it just after the project is done?
Well, no, usually, I mean, these days, like with Horizon Chase 2, everybody got to hear them on the development team, and it was always good to hear some feedback from everybody about what they liked, what they didn't like. And but usually, yeah, I'm freelance, and I tend to work for a lot of smaller teams. I do a lot of music for kids' toys and stuff, so I'm isolated a lot from having to deal with tons of people, which is great because sometimes it's too much. Too much feedback is a bad thing. Just let me break some tunes, make some noise.
And Mr. Ritchie, let me ask you one thing. You are working on virtual reality, right?
Yeah.
What's like to work with this kind of huge open world?
It is definitely very different moving to virtual reality. I spent a lot of time not doing virtual reality. I've done a lot of racing games and combat games and things like that since Top Gear. And moving into virtual reality is quite freeing in some regards, because you are going back to older techniques to try and get the processing speed on fairly low power devices to get virtual reality to work at a decent frame rate. It's not quite as primitive as the Super Nintendo, but it is still trying to use older techniques to get that speed up and running, and that sense of immersion that you really need from virtual reality without making people sick. So I've been fortunate enough to work on some games that people will have maybe been familiar with in virtual reality, if you're at all familiar with virtual reality. And I've also worked for some of the one or two companies who've actually developed some of the headsets or parts of the headsets. So I worked for Tobii Eye Tracking for a while, working on getting eye tracking into VR headsets. And these days I'm mostly doing work for Skydance Interactive, working on the Walking Dead Saints and Sinners series and other titles that I can't talk about. So that's been a lot of fun. Killing a lot of zombies during the day and not killing them at night. But yeah, I spend a vast amount of my time in virtual reality at the moment.
Still have to use the old tricks to skip the dizziness of the glasses?
Not necessarily the really old tricks. I mean, some of them you still use from old hardware, but it's more with virtual reality. You can't use the latest graphics techniques yet. You will be able to as the hardware advances, but you have to try and make things look as good as possible with slightly older techniques. So a lot of games these days, for the best look, will do something that's called deferred rendering, which in virtual reality tends to be just too expensive. So you have to go back to what's called forward rendering, and then you have to throw in other little tricks to hide a lot of graphics to try and just get the speed up and keep it up while still having enough moving on the screen. Particularly if you want to have a zombie horde coming after you, you just can't. You've got to be as quick, make sure that updates as quick as possible without making people sick, which can happen if you start to lose the frame rate too much. So a lot of my time is spent actually just optimizing graphics for virtual reality and adding particular techniques into the games. So a lot of the things I've added have been lighting techniques and techniques for severing characters. I am unfortunately responsible for some of the chainsaw severing in Saints and Sinners Retribution, together with a big art team. It is a very collaborative thing these days. You can't do everything by yourself just as the programmer. You need a lot of the data to be marked up by the art team, and it's quite an involved process to mark things up. So hopefully people who have managed to play Retribution, Saints and Sinners Retribution, or Saints and Sinners the original, will have seen some of my work, even if they may not know which bits I did.
In my opinion, Saints and Sinners is a piece of art for the virtual reality. Is the game I ever liked to play since the very beginning. I put the glasses, I feel inside the ambience, and I played a lot. I get really sweated running from the zombies. You made a great job.
Well, I had a contribution, and that is the difference between now and then. I am part of a very big team, as opposed to back with Top Gear when we were a very, very small team. Small team of engineers, small team of artists. and obviously Barry doing the music. We just did not have.
You were the team.
Okay. I didn't do all the graphics though. We had Greggs and Bernie doing the graphics. So yeah, but it wasn't a team that you would recognize these days as a team. It was just a very small handful of people who came together and produced the game. And yes, I'm also pretty sure that I wasn't a very nice person back then. So I apologize if I was very rude to Barry, because I probably was. I think I was rude to everybody.
Programmers usually are, but I mean, people.
I do remember being very socially inept, and I would say what I thought, but I thought it with no filter.
I mean, you had to have no bullshit, because you get called out, and if you start saying you're something, the hardware can do this and it can't do it, well, you get called out on that bullshit. So you need to be straightforward.
Yeah, possibly you do. It was of the time. I think it was definitely, it showed. I mean, it fitted with the whole environment of the time, where people were quite short and quite just to the point. And there was no malice, I don't think, with anybody at all. It was just...
everybody had respect for everybody else. If you could do the job, walk the walk, then hell. Exactly.
But there was some rough and tumble, but most people knew not to take it, personally, because it wasn't personal. When people were angry, it was because they were angry at a piece of software. They were angry at a piece of hardware. They weren't angry at the person that they were shouting at. They were just kind of like, I'm angry with this piece of hardware, so I'm shouting.
I ran into trouble with that when I got hired at Fisher Price. They put us in cubicles in this big football field size office, and I've got these horrible little development kits for the toy chips that barely worked. I mean, these were the first ones where they started putting digital audio into toys, and so I'm sitting there with a Windows 95 PC trying to compile things, and there's no error messages, there's no manual for these things, and I'm sitting there in my little cubicle, and people are prairie dogging to see who's swearing. Who's that? Every 15 seconds or so, someone says "fuck." Oh, who is that? Who is? It's like, oh.
Melhor? Vamos começar a assistir esse vídeo em inglês, sem legendas? Que tal você clicar aqui embaixo na descrição no curso de inglês do professor Jonas Bressan, o método BEWAY, por apenas R$ 497, ou 12 vezes de R$ 49,70. É mais barato do que uma pizza aqui na minha cidade. Você tem acesso a um curso completo, com um professor com mais de 10 anos de experiência. São mais de 150 videoaulas e você vai dominar o idioma tranquilamente. Meu querido amigo Jonas, lá no Instagram, você segue ele lá, procura Jonas Bressan. Ele vai ensinar você algumas dicas, ele vai trazer informações e muito conteúdo gratuito de inglês para vocês. E mais, esse curso oferece certificado de conclusão. Ele vem contando as horas cursadas. Você pode usar ele para poder fazer o seu currículo. É um curso completo. Não é qualquer curso de internet. É um dos top 10 cursos mais vendidos do Brasil hoje.